Generational trauma still affects the Timpanogos today. In 1865, his uncle Tabby, the nation's principal chief, asked him to be the war chief of the Timpanogos. The following year, his father, Chief Sandpitch, was murdered at Birch Creek near the Mormon settlement of Morona, Utah. As war chief, Black Hawk formed alliances with Paiute and Navajo bands against the Mormon settlers in what became known as the Black Hawk War from 1865 to 1872. Although Black Hawk himself made peace in 1867, other bands continued the war until the United States intervened with about 200 troops in 1872. The 21st century Utah historian John Alton Peterson describes Black Hawk as having remarkable vision and capacity. Given the circumstances under which he operated, he put together an imposing war machine and masterminded a sophisticated strategy that suggests he had a keen grasp of the economic, political, and geographic contexts in which he operated. Comparable to Cochise, Sitting Bull, and Geronimo, Black Hawk fostered an extraordinary pan-regional movement that enabled him to operate in an enormous section of country and established a three-phase war. Black Hawk worked to establish a barrier to white expansion and actually succeeded in collapsing the line of Mormon settlement, causing scores of villages in over half a dozen counties to be abandoned. For almost a decade, the tide of white expansion in Utah came to a dead stop, and in most of the territory, actually receded. Like other defenders of Indian rights, though, Black Hawk found he could not hold his position, and his efforts eventually crumbled. Black Hawk understood that he could undermine the Mormon economy by stealing large numbers of cattle and flooding the market with a surplus of Mormon beef. Black Hawk instructed his warriors to never fire except in defense. During a battle at Gravelly Ford, near Richfield, on June 10, 1866, Black Hawk was shot while trying to rescue a fallen warrior, Whitehorse. The wound never healed. In 1867, Black Hawk made peace with the Palefaces. In 1870, Black Hawk, in severe pain, gaunt and hollow-eyed, knowing he would soon die, began his mission of peace. It took him 12 days to ride by horseback 180 miles from Cedar City to Spring Lake, visiting every Mormon settlement along the way. He apologized for the pain and suffering he caused and pleaded to end the bloodshed. Mormon leaders didn't do this. It took an extraordinary man and a compassionate leader to do such a thing. Why would a man who saw his world turned upside down, his kin murdered, starved to death, dying from white man's disease, spend his last days on earth apologizing to the very people who destroyed his world? The answer to this question is only found in understanding the Timpanogos culture and religious heritage. You must walk a mile in their blood-soaked moccasins. Black Hawk lived by the 7 sacred teachings of his ancestors: love, respect, kindness, courage, generosity, and honesty. The Timpanogos walk softly upon Mother Earth. Black Hawk died in 1870 of tuberculosis, induced by his wound 4 years prior, and was buried near his birthplace in Spring Lake, but his journey was not yet over. In 1919, 49 years after his burial, members of the Mormon Church robbed Black Hawk's grave. In the Google folder, there is a photo of William E. Croft standing in the excavated grave, grinning from ear to ear and holding Black Hawk's skull. Also in there, since it's such a poor resolution, there's an AI enhanced, but just know that that's AI and not the actual photo. But the original is in there as well. Black Hawk's remains, together with articles taken from the grave, a china pipe, the saddle, portions of his horse's bridle, sleigh bells, axe, bucket, beads, and part of an old soldier coat with the brass button still intact, were displayed at the Spanish Fort Co-op hardware store for several days. The bones were then moved to the LDS Church Museum, and an article was printed in the September 20, 1919 Deseret Evening News, a scan of which is also in the Google photo. Headline, Bones of Black Hawk Indian Warrior now on exhibition, LDS Museum. A case on the north side of the LDS Church Museum is destined to become the center of interest to many a student of early day Utah history, for resting peacefully in the midst of the very white settlers whom he loved to harass is all that remains of Chief Black Hawk, who in the early 60s was dreaded and feared in many a town and settlement of Utah. What are declared to be the bones of the Indian desperado have been brought from their final resting place near Spring Lake Villa, and now, along with spurs, beads, sleigh bells, axe, bucket, brass buttons, and all such comforts which were supposed to accompany him to the happy hunting grounds, are on display to the eyes of the white trespassers whom he so much resented. For decades, the remains of Black Hawk and those of an Indian woman and a child were on display in the Church Museum for the public to see as a mere curiosity. And then they disappeared. The living descendants of Black Hawk were outraged, but their angry voices fell on deaf ears. Mormon church leaders made no apologies and expressed no conscience or remorse. Despite a federal law passed in 1906 called the Graves Protection Act, descendants of Black Hawk had no real legal recourse until the enactment of the National American Graves Protection Reparation Act passed in 1994. It took an act of Congress, the help of National Forest Service archaeologist Charmaine Thompson, and the humanitarian efforts of a Boy Scout named Shane Armstrong to find and rebury the remains of Chief Black Hawk at Spring Lake. In a private conversation with Shane and his mother, Shane explained to Philip Gottfredson, "I felt it in my heart I should find Black Hawk's remains." Inspired at the age of 14, Shane, on his own, made contact with Thompson. He explained the frustration of finding Chief Black Hawk's remains. No one knew where they were. After a month of searching, they located the lost remains of the chief in a cardboard box in a basement storage room on the campus of Brigham Young University. 77 years after Mormon church members robbed his grave and 126 years after his death, Chief Black Hawk's mortal remains were returned to the place of his birth and reburied on May 2nd, 1996 at Spring Lake. There are photos of his current grave in the Google photo. Now it is 176 years since the Provo River Massacre, which took the lives of 102 Timpanogos and marked the beginning of a genocide that reduced the Timpanogos population from about 70,000 to about 900. The Timpanogos population is now about 1% of what it was before the Provo River Massacre. When General Wells wrote the extermination order, there was no difference between the Mormon Church's religious leaders and the political leaders of the Provisional State of Deseret. From that day to this, no political or religious leader of either organization or their descendants has rescinded the extermination order. Erasure of the history, culture, identity, and the people of the Timpanogos Nation continues to this day. They are often not recognized as a separate tribe, but lumped in with the Utes. Their history, language, and culture are not Ute, but Shoshone. They are often denied services, including running water and electricity to their homes on the reservation unless they deny their heritage and register as Utes. Even the common names for the massacre erase the Timpanogos people. It is known as the Provo River Massacre. The river at the time was called the Timpanogos River and was named after the people whose valley this was. The river has been renamed for a white man, Etienne Provost. The name Provo River Massacre erases the Timpanogos people who were massacred. It is also called the Fort Utah Massacre, as if it was the perpetrators who were the victims. Even worse, it is sometimes called the Battle at Fort Utah, denying the massive and one-sided casualties, the extreme power imbalance, the official extermination orders, and the continuing genocide it started. White people, Mormon pioneers, like my ancestors, stole the Timpanogos land, enslaved them, and killed them. What reparations are possible for such crimes? Is there enough money in the world? Are there scales large enough to balance justice? I do not know the answers to these questions, but we cannot approach justice without asking them. We cannot begin without a knowledge of the history that has been hidden. We cannot begin without listening to those that have been harmed.
Aho.
Thank you, Ken.
I want to thank you all for coming and participating. I know for a lot of you this might be